You are listening to the Ready PDM Network.
Today's episode was brought to you by Eigenworks. Most companies don't know why they lose deals, and few know why they win. Eigenworks can tell you why. With the buyer as hero approach, Eigenworks gets deep insight into the reasons organizations make buying decisions. The product, promotion, and sales insights provide Eigenworks clients with a significant competitive position in their marketplaces.
Are you ready?
I recommend starting by examining the user experience of our products.
Okay, fine.
And then talk to some customers to learn about their needs and tasks.
Fine. Wait. No, you can't talk to customers.
Talking to customers is important to focus product requirements on user tasks.
You aren't allowed to talk to customers. Only salespeople talk to customers.
UX has an implication on your entire product life cycle.
The cab stand at Newark Airport. You get there, there's 75 people in line, and there are 75 cabs, and it takes an hour. And there's a man in a uniform who will get you in trouble if you just go and get in a taxi. If they just said, Craigslist style, everyone go, and got out of the way, it would work.
You wouldn't design a building in kind of little chunks.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe you would, but I don't think buildings typically get built that way.
Each day, we interact with thousands of objects. Objects as simple as a toothbrush or a coffee cup, as complicated as a computer or an automobile. But not all of these items are designed to be easy to use.
They're the first people who are allowing others to see the product in some kind of a form that's not just ideas or a list of requirements.
Okay. And on a scale of 1 to 7, with 1 being very difficult and 7 being very easy, how difficult would you say that it was for you to eat this orange?
So 1 is really difficult?
Yes, 1 very difficult, 7 very easy.
I will say 2.
2.
Only because I've had worse luck with grapefruit.
Grapefruit is worse.
Grapefruit's worse.
You seek out work that better aligns with what you do creatively.
Each customer, let's say, donates an average of $50 over the course of a year. So you are losing $2,500 a day or $912,500 a year. We can estimate you're going to spend $100,000 improving the user experience. It will take you 40 days or a little over a month then to realize the investment.
UX is about thinking about your entire product and how your customers interact with it.
Hello, Ready Product Radio heads, and welcome to another exciting episode of Ready Product Radio. This week we talk with Brett Maraldo, user experience architect, researcher, and designer with over 20 years of experience in user-centered design. For products to be successful, to be loved, the customer or user experience is everything. That is why Ready Product Principle number 0 is start with the customer experience. In this episode, Brett and I unpack user experience, explore the tensions that may arise between UX, ideals, and lean or agile approaches, and discuss some compromises for how these facets of product creation can coexist. Ready Product Principle number 1 is obsess over the user experience. Enjoy the show. Brett Maraldo, welcome to Ready Product Radio, and thanks for taking the time to speak with us. You and I have been connected on LinkedIn since, I think, about 2011, but maybe for our audience, we can start with an introduction. Who are you? What is your day job? And how long have you been involved in user experience and usability?
Sure. Well, my name's Brett Maraldo, and I've been doing this kind of since the beginning. I started working on the web in 1991 when it was, text-only web browser on Next boxes, and it was purely academic at the time, and I was just helping researchers move their research papers into this new medium and hyperlinking and stuff like that. But at the time, what I was doing for an income was I was doing desktop publishing freelance. So I got a lot of experience in chops and typography and layout and that kind of thing. And then over the years, I started getting requests from clients to do CD-ROM type work. You remember that little area of time there when CD-ROMs were a big thing?
Yeah.
And then the web started slowly evolving into something that was a little bit more sophisticated. And then people started getting it in their homes. And then clients were asking me, do you build a website? So that resulted in me saying yes and learning how to be a one-man shop web developer, designer, like everybody was doing back then. And then it just grew a little bit more in the 90s, and I started jumping on projects with teams, still on a freelance capacity. So I worked on GM Canada's first website.
Nice.
I did Toronto Maple Leafs first website. I did a website for Nash the Slash. That was around 1994, 95. So he was an early adopter. Yeah, and then as the rules started evolving, because the one-man shop idea or one-person shop idea didn't suffice anymore, and it was kind of like, okay, what area of this do I want to do? And I just felt my competencies laid in the tell me what your problem is, what you want to achieve, and I'll design a solution for you, but at a conceptual level. And that is now what we know as user experience, fill in the blank, whatever you want to call that, user experience design, user experience architecture. So that's where I've come from, and that's what I do now. And I'm a consultant, independent consultant. So I work for myself. I have clients, I work for them, and try to do good user experience design.
Nice. Well, that's great, and I'm really looking forward to this, Brett, because I've been talking to a lot of product management folks, but I want to have the Ready Product Management podcast, which is about helping product people of all disciplines be ready for the many challenges they face in their product journeys. So I want to talk to UX people like yourself. I want to talk to developers. So this is going to be great. Brett, I usually pick 3 questions or topics to focus on. I find that's about the right length. So hopefully this will be the first of many discussions that you and I can have. But I thought the 3 topics would be, number 1, the problem with UX, because I've seen you mention some stuff, I think, on LinkedIn, and I was intrigued about that. And then the second topic I thought is, okay, since we've covered the problem, number 2, maybe what is the ideal scenario for what you see in terms of leveraging UX, working with, let's say, a product manager and an Agile dev team. And then thirdly, maybe we can talk specifically about UX and Lean, and what are some of the trends that maybe you're seeing at this intersection. Do those 3 topics sound like good ones?
Yeah, those are excellent.
Okay, excellent. So let's start with the first one. So in your opinion and experience, what is the problem with UX right now?
Well, it's interesting that you would phrase the question that way, because it implies that there is a problem with UX. And one could argue as a UX practitioner that the problem isn't so much with UX, that it may lie elsewhere. However, I don't think that that's a good approach either. I think we have to be positive and constructive and just talk about what is UX and how does it fit in to the workflow of getting a product out there. And yes, there are some challenges. So I would say that the biggest challenge is that businesses, I don't think, from my experience, I don't think they really realize how big UX is. UX is a pretty big thing. Let me explain. UX is about the user experience of your product. It's not about where does the button go or what is on that screen. It's about the entire end-to-end experience that you give your customer with your product. And so as a UX practitioner, that's what you're considering. And that's hard to do at early stages of the product development, because You may not even have a product developed. It may just be an idea. So the UX practitioner comes in and considers all of the detail. It's a very detail oriented kind of process to do UX, because you have to think about, well, who are the users? Who are our customers? How do they think? What are their behaviors in terms of using a product similar to this? What do we think they're like? If you look at all of that, it gets really big, and that bigness takes time, and it takes money, and it takes an understanding and acknowledgement of the value that UX brings to the product design. And where I find the biggest problem with UX is that businesses don't really see that. They just, I'm not sure what they see, but it seems like, we just come in and whip up some wireframes for us and you're done. And I think that UX practitioners, we approach the problem solving in many different ways, and some people are good at that. They're good at just whipping some wireframes together, and they don't really care about the bigger picture. But UX is really about the bigger picture. So if you truly want UX, you have to consider the scope and increase that you're bringing into your project by bringing UX into it.
Yeah, and it's interesting as you were talking there, Brett, what I was thinking about, I've been in product management for about 20 years, and we've had a journey that maybe you're saying UX is suffering from as well, which is that really the main value when we all went to training, let's say at Pragmatic Marketing, it was really the main value was group therapy, because we were all saying, why don't people understand, what it is? Because it was the same challenge with product management as what you're saying with UX. Product management we viewed as very broad, touching on all aspects of the business, but the rest of the organization didn't necessarily understand or appreciate that. Is that a fair comparison? Or
yeah, I think so. I think that UX implies that we're going to focus the product in terms of the interaction of the product and the customer, that we're going to tailor the product for the customer, for their needs and expectations, and create a kind of a pleasing interaction between the customer and the product. Well, you can't do that unless you actually unless you consider what that design needs to be, and that adds to the product design. Whereas business is often focused on keeping costs down, getting things done quickly, and maximizing profits. And those run, like when you break it down, that's what business is focused on. Nobody goes into business to not make money. That's why they go into business. User experience consumes money, and it consumes time. And the idea is you're going to get a payoff at the end, but business doesn't see that payoff. They don't see it. So there's often this confluence between UX and business, whereby UX is essentially pressured to reduce the scope as much as possible to reduce costs and maximize profits. And then in doing that, you're compromising that user experience you're trying to build, and you're not building that so that people walk away happy. You're building that so your customers walk away happy, with the intent that your customers are going to increase your business. Business people, in my experience, a lot of times don't make that connection, and then they don't understand when they get UX involved why it's going to take so long and why it's going to cost so much. And then we often end up asking ourselves, why are we here? I hear that so much from my UX colleagues. It's like, they hired me and now here's where we're at. I ask myself, why am I here? That's one of the biggest challenges, I think, is trying to help people, everybody, not just the business, because everybody in the organization, everybody on the teams, we all need to feel like each other's providing value to our goal. And I find that that's for some reason it's hard for people to see the value of UX.
So when I put the question, what's the problem with UX? It sounds like you're saying the biggest problem is having the business, not the techies, but the business have an appreciation for a the breadth of UX, and B, the fact that it's not something that you can do quickly. It's something that's going to take some time to do properly and be ready for it to take that time. Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying. However, when we talk about lean later on, we'll be talking about how UX can fit into that. Because with lean, it can't be this big process, a big part of the project. You have to be much more strategic and around what you're doing with UX. But then you start, it's a compromise that you have to make. You know, that pick 2 of 3, right? Time, cost, and quality. So, you know, we'll get to that with the lean discussion, but that's going to be a really big part of that. But that's what it comes down to when you look at UX or any other role in product. It comes down to, you know, what do you want? Do you want it fast? Do you want it cheap? Or do you want good quality? And UX is usually an enhancement to a product. UX usually implies an enhancement of quality. So you've automatically chosen quality out of the 3. So now you have to choose one more of the other 2. Do you want it to be fast, or do you want to spend more money on it? And that's where business gets in the way a lot of the times, because they don't want it to cost more and they don't want it to take more time, yet they want that quality. So what ends up happening a lot of the times is that the project, if you will, the team starts chipping away at the UX, and then the quality starts diminishing so that they can reprioritize over to time or money.
So let me ask you this then. So when the way you're talking and what I hear you saying, would it be fair to say that if we were to think of some of the well-known companies out there, that really, from a values perspective, Apple is really the one that comes to mind in terms of a business saying we are going to value the experience, the overall experience, the macro experience of the product over everything else? Because I think they do that.
Yeah, I've never worked for Apple, but
you've used their products, I imagine.
Well, I've been an Apple customer since 1981.
There you go. Yeah,
I'm not an Apple fanboy anymore, though.
Okay.
But you know, from what I understand of the inner workings of Apple over the years, you know, with back with the operating system, I think is even back in terms of System 6. System 7, you know, when with Mac pluses and that, you know, Apple had they had a kind of a process. They had a document. I don't remember the name of it, but it was it documented basically the user interface elements and how everything is supposed to work together in their operating system, so that when application developers were going to develop an app for even early Mac OS, I'm saying System 7, you might run on your Mac Plus. There were strict guidelines around the user interface and what the menu should be and all of that from Apple that you had to follow. So there was this consistency, and Apple saw the value in that. So I agree with you. I think Apple is an example of a company that prioritizes UX higher than you might see some other companies.
And just to carry that out, what I'm thinking, back to your point, Brett, about, okay, so they're valuing quality very clearly. The next one becomes money. They do charge a premium for that quality experience, but it's a premium that at least a certain percentage of the market is willing to pay. In other words, they've identified that there is a segment of the market that is willing to basically sacrifice low price by paying a higher price because they appreciate the difference. So that as well as part of what you're saying as well is valuing it over the cost element, right?
Yeah, and I think that's kind of an accepted, known aspect of Apple customers, that they're willing to pay the extra money for that Apple experience. And just today, I was talking to a guy who was looking to hire somebody, and he was looking at their resume and portfolio, and said to me, oh yeah, but they look more like a Microsoft guy than an Apple guy, and I really want that kind of Apple mentality, right?
Value system,
So people can even, make hiring decisions based on whether they peg you as like an Apple person versus a Microsoft person.
Exactly. Yeah. Good. So why don't we transition then, Brett, to the second topic? So we've identified what maybe a big problem is with UX. So let's say I was to, I had magical powers and I could create the perfect environment for you in terms of a product manager, an agile development team, and a UX expert like yourself. Talk to me about what that environment would look like. How would those folks interact? At what point in the product life cycle would we bring in the UX person? Like, paint me a picture of how that ideal scenario should look like.
Okay, so we're going to talk about an ideal scenario.
Yes.
Now, let's just
perfect world.
Let's just define that sense of ideal as being, from my perspective, as a UX practitioner.
Exactly.
So not ideal, say, from the perspective of the business or anybody else. So from a UX perspective, the ideal scenario, in my opinion, would be to prioritize UX highly and make the time and the space and the budget allow for the creation of a good user experience for the product. Now, in that sense, we're not talking about lean. We might be talking about agile, but we're definitely not talking about lean, because UX is going to take time. So in that ideal scenario, the first thing that we want is an input. There's two things that we want as an input. We want business requirements, because we want to understand what the goal of the business is. And then we also want to understand what the goals are or the behavior is of the business's customers. So we can do the business so again, this takes time to do this. The business requirements, you have your stakeholder requirements gathering focused on UX though. So you might have some meetings with the business stakeholders to collect their requirements with the focus on what we need for the UX part of that. But then the bigger part is the customers, the users, user research. And that can be, there isn't like one way to do that. It could be as simple as using, searching the web to get some information about users that use a product like the one that we want to build. That might be the simplest thing you could do. It's not the best, but at least it gives you some information. The ideal scenario is to actually do user research with users that you think at that time, as best as you can, represent your customers. And so you might actually do some user research in the form of user testing on competitor products, bring some users in, write a structured task-based usability test. You could possibly do some maybe focus groups, but those have a limited amount. So what I'm talking about here is a fair amount of work right at the beginning to understand the user, understand what they're thinking, figure out what maybe some of their pain points are around similar type products. Gather that together, and then you then we would want to like document that. Not crazy amounts of documentation. You don't have to go into like a waterfall approach with crazy documentation, but you at least want to figure out, okay, we can group our users in these kind of profiles. And then you want to understand, with respect to your product, what are some of the key tasks that these users may want to do. And then you figure that out, and you collaborate with your team, and you prioritize them. And then from those key tasks, you can break those down into pieces of functionality and features. And once you have those features and functionality, then you can start to build out your wireframes. Wireframes are really powerful because they're so quick to make. And with some of the tools we have today, you can almost instantly create a workable, clickable prototype as well. And I'm working on a project right now where that's exactly what we're doing. We're building out these wireframes. People will have ideas. I put them in the wireframes. I output a prototype, and then everybody can play with the prototype. You build your prototype, you play with it, you make sure that it makes sense, and it addresses all of your requirements, going back to the requirements, business and user. And then you probably would be good to do some user testing on that to validate, to make sure that there aren't any major problems with it. Fix those problems, and then pass the documentation onto the next step, which might be visual design, might be development. Now that I've just described a waterfall approach. Now you may have an agile team in there. So now things get a little bit more complicated, because when I talked about the ideal UX process, when you're talking about agile, it's still, you can still do UX in agile. A lot of people, a lot of us do that. It's a little bit harder because to do a really good job with UX, you have to think of the whole system from end to end. So when the user, comes to the first page, and then the next step, and the next step, and then, all the different branches and So really, when you're building the user experience, think about when you use an app or a website or anything. You're going through different pages, you're clicking on different things are happening. So from an ideal UX perspective, you need to look at all that, because you might end up working on a screen or something towards the end, and that may have implications on something at the start of the user experience. So see, this is, if you think of agile, how do you do UX in the context of agile, which is about kind of breaking your product down into chunks, into smaller chunks, and then prioritizing those chunks in your backlog, and then building the chunks out in a sprint leading up to a release.
So let's pause there before we make that transition. So what you've just described is the ideal scenario. And as you hinted earlier, you're investing a lot of energy up front before you even start doing any wireframing or anything that resembles the final product. You're spending a lot on understanding the user, understanding their goals. So before we get into Agile, I guess just to put a stake in the sand there, what I'm sensing is, as you said yourself, that really the ideal scenario would be a waterfall model whereby you can look at the whole product holistically. I know that's redundant, up front, before, like you say, you break it down into chunks. Is that fair in terms of the ideal scenario?
Yeah, and I don't think you have to, in the ideal scenario, I don't think you have to do like a giant chunk of work.
Right.
But I think that you have to at least have considered the whole experience and how the users interact with it. So in a waterfall approach, you can usually spend a lot of time doing that and do a really great job. In a more agile approach, you maybe do a smaller amount of the user research just to get what you need, just to get some sense of insight into what users may want and what they're expecting. and then you can break it out into smaller pieces. But it's really challenging to fully integrate a UX practitioner into an agile development process. That gets really hard. And I think, agile it's a really incredible tool on the development side for building out code and ultimately a product. But it is a tool on the development side. And I think
Exactly.
I think too many organizations try to they say, wow, this agile thing works really well for our dev team. Let's get everybody else involved. And it doesn't work the way that we work in design, be that UX or visual design. That's the creative side of product. Dev is the engineering side of product. And I think I think things would work way better if managers and businesses could recognize that they're very different ways of working, and they're also very different psychologies. Like the people that do UX and visual design, the creatives, they have a very different way of thinking and doing what they do than developers do.
But I imagine one thing that came to mind there, Brett, as you were talking, I imagine you could make a lot of money if you wrote a book where the title was Agile UX, a practitioner's guide. You would sell probably, thousands of copies, right?
Well, I have
people would love to believe that that's possible, right?
Yeah, I have a number of those books.
Okay.
And they all do the same thing, and that is they deconstruct UX and then they fit it into the Agile framework, because that's what business wants. But and you can do that, but you have to accept that you're making a compromise to the UX at that point. It's not about the UX as much now as it is about your team and how they work together. So I think it's a very tricky thing to do good UX in a process where you're not necessarily thinking about the entire product and the users and the customers that use that product. That's what UX people do. That's what the way we think about the problem solving.
So let's talk about some organizational stuff, Brett, in terms of where we could fit it, because I know I've certainly got ideas based on what you said. So one idea would be, even if I do have an agile environment, is bring the UX person in, or the UX expertise. It could be the same as the product. The product manager could be a UX expert. We don't know, but bring that expertise to bear before you even start considering doing any development. In other words, bring that expertise to bear to understand the end user psychology, the end user goals, and all of that, so that, as you say, when it comes time to actually say, okay, let's start using Agile to build some minimal viable products or minimal lovable products, that the UX person has at least had a running start. Would that be a potential model that could work?
Yep. That like do a phase or a pass of the entire product from the UX design perspective, but not do it with some amount of excruciating detail. Perhaps you compromise the user research at the beginning and you just utilize your own experience as a UX practitioner, which we call heuristic decisions, and leverage that along with possibly some non-first-hand research around the users. I mean, there's a lot of information on the net about users and then maybe do an initial quick design of the entire system and get that sort of sorted out, so that at least we know something about the end-to-end design of it. And then possibly you could pass that on to the dev team, and then they can start looking for opportunities to break it out into dev stories and start building things. But UX, like one way that I've seen of bringing Agile into UX is that you have your Agile team, and it's comprised of developers, everybody on the team. So you have developers, you have visual designers, you have UX, and everybody works at the same time on the stories in the backlog. But you can see the problem there is that the stories are pieces of functionality that the dev team's going to build. So what the UX person's going to do is they're going to build the wireframes for that. But what's in the wireframe for that particular piece of functionality may have implications elsewhere in the product, and then the whole workflow breaks down.
Right.
And the only way out of that is for the UX person to not consider the impact of that particular story on the rest of the product, and then you end up with a bunch of risks around the quality of your end product. So it's a very challenging thing, and I don't think anybody really has an answer. But I think what you've proposed is definitely one way that UX could work. Do like an initial pass of the whole thing, and then chunk it out, and then let the UX person refine their designs while the dev team is building, and then you can possibly have this interaction between the dev team doing their Agile methodology and the UX practitioner. For example, you may not have all of the UI defined on a screen in this first initial pass. So when the dev team gets it, they're going to want to know more detail, like what does this button do? What does this do? So they can go back to the UX person and say, we're working on this story. We need more detailed wireframes. The UX person then builds out those wireframes, but at least they're building them out now and adding more detail to a less detailed overall approach.
Yeah, exactly. So I want to make sure I understand you correctly, Brett. So I think what you're saying is the typical practice, i.e., if we went out to 100 different shops, we know that, I don't know, 95% of them, or 95 of those 100 are going to be Agile shops. So I think what I hear you saying is, because of the prevalence of Agile, that UX ends up being compromised to fit into Agile. Did I hear you correctly? That's the typical case?
Yeah.
Okay. So just want to make sure I understood that. So why don't we transition now and talk about UX and lean, because you're right. We've kind of on the dev side, and especially on the business side, we've now gone to lean. Folks like Eric Rees and the Lean Startup and Steve Blank. So give me some of your thoughts about what you're seeing with regard to UX and lean, and are there any models there that are working? Are there models that aren't working? Talk to me a little bit about what's going on with UX and lean.
Okay. So, I mean, I'm not a lean expert, so I have my understanding of lean, and I've worked on a lean project. So what I gather from lean, and correct me if I'm wrong from your experience, is that lean is a way to get a product out faster. Is that right? Is that
yeah,
why
well, I don't know that you necessarily put the emphasis on the speed so much as and I can speak to this a little bit because I'm currently working in an organization that has a manufacturing element. So lean goes way back in manufacturing, as you may know. So it's not necessarily about the speed; it's about the elimination of waste. So I think where that comes into play in things like new product development is getting away from the idea of if we build it, they will come. In other words, if we don't really understand what customers and users want, then we want to minimize waste, then the pragmatic thing is to build a smaller scope product first, get some feedback on that, because then if we've gotten it wrong, then the amount of waste in that wrongness is smaller. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, so it's about elimination of waste, I would say, is the is the focus. But anyways, continue.
Okay, so so basically in lean, you're focusing on, we'll say, the minimum feature set that you need in order to have a functioning product.
Correct.
And but the implications of that are that we'll be adding features and functions later.
Right. Definitely.
So now you can see from a dev perspective, no problem, because as long as your framework and your technology is extensible and your code, you can add things to it, right?
Right.
But from a user experience perspective, the things that you're adding, you don't have any visibility to that because you haven't determined them yet.
Right.
So every time you change the product, you add a change to it, it may have an implication to the overall user experience.
Yep.
It may not have an implication to the code because you can just add that chunk of functionality, but it probably will have an implication to the overall user experience. So that is, I think, one of the biggest areas of confluence between UX and lean, is that you don't have the opportunity to understand the bigger picture and make sure that you build a UX framework that is extensible. What I mean by that is a UX framework would be something like the navigation system.
Right.
Now, the problem is you might build a navigation system that works for your initial lean cut, but then later on, as you're gathering user input and you're validating your hypotheses, that may require a completely different approach to the navigation system. So now what you've gone and done is you're changing the navigation system on the user. Now, that's we call that a user irritant. So you just have to accept that if you're using lean, that your priority isn't the user experience. Your priority is other things. And that's a real challenge, I think, for business, because they don't want to make that compromise. Business wants everything, right? They want everything cheap and as cheaply as they can get it. And that's not going to work. I mean, if you're not allowing the UX people to consider the entire system, then you're only building for what you know now. And yeah, there may be implications in the future, whereby you may have to put more load on your dev team because now they've got to build a whole new navigation system. So that's one example of the risks that you take in going lean. And as long as you accept those risks and you don't put too much pressure on your UX people, and you know that those risks going in, and you know that the implications of those risks, because if you make a decision, then if you didn't prepare for this, say you're the project manager and you're working for you're working for the boss. So now and let's say you didn't think about this, and then 2 years down the line, your UX person says, okay, we know that our users want all this stuff now, but I'm going to have to completely change the navigation system.
Right.
Dev team size this. Dev team says, oh, well, we have to rip apart all the code, and this is just going to take like 2 months to do. So then the business says, no, we don't want to do that. And now what do you do? Right. So I think, going back to your first question, the problem with UX, I think it applies to kind of, if I can sum it up, I think it applies to everything we've talked about. And that is that UX isn't just hiring people to do wireframes for you. UX is about thinking about your entire product and how your customers interact with it. And then it's up to you to identify the implications of that. What are the constraints? What are the dependencies of that? What are the risks? It's not just about hiring people to do wireframes. And UX has an implication on your entire product life cycle, and it has implications on your team, because you may have a development team, and you may be starting in a lean or agile methodology, building out the product, and perhaps in a lean sense, maybe you don't have UX or creative people involved initially for the first few months while you get your product built, right? Now you decide, okay, now we want to increase the UX of it, as as some people put it, and then they'll go and they'll hire a UX person. Well, that UX process, that UX concept now being brought into your organization has implications on your scope. It has implications on your team. I mean, I've experienced things like, where the developers are called on to make UX decisions, because there is no UX or creative person. So now those developers, they love it. Maybe they enjoy providing that UX context, building the user interface, how things hook up, what the should we have a dialogue here or not, what would be work for the user or whatever. Now, and then 6 months later, now you bring a UX person in. Now you're going to have to manage that. Now you're offloading all that UX work you had on your developers now onto this UX person. That can cause interpersonal conflicts. So you can't just hire UX people. You really have to think about the implications of that. It's like it's like putting an addition on your house in order to make your life easier and better. You can't just like call a contractor and say, okay, build me an extension to my house. There's a whole bunch of stuff that has to go on. I had two friends that had to move out of their house for months while they did that. I think that's the biggest thing, is really think about what the impacts are of UX on your product and on your team, and identify those things and be objective about it. Do the constraints, the dependencies, the risks, and address that, and then you'll be better prepared for when UX comes in. And you may decide, it's not worth it for us to do that.
So all good stuff, Brett. Let's go back before we leave that. So I still don't understand myself, and that's because I don't have a UX specialist, like a specific role on the team that I'm working with right now. But where do you usually see the UX expert working? Think about a typical organization. Are they typically brought in by the development VP? Are they typically brought in by the product management organization? Are they typically brought in as an external consultant? Like where does the UX person usually come in and fit in the organization?
Okay, well,
or a couple examples, whatever. Whatever you can share.
Sure. So most companies that have, we'll call it a product. It could be a website. It could be apps or something like that. Think of a bank. Think of a bank's website and think of their apps as being their product. So that's what being very general about it. So most companies, they have a UX team. So they could also be an agency, like a creative agency building products for companies, websites, apps, whatever. So you'll typically have UX people on those teams, and where they're situated is usually kind of at the start of thinking about the product. They're part of the strategy team. They're part of the planning team, because the UX practitioner is taking, if you will, they're taking the requirements and the ideas, and they're doing the first iteration of the product in the form, usually, of wireframes or some kind of a prototype. So they're the first people who are allowing others to see the product in some kind of a form that's not just ideas or a list of requirements. And all the other processes, all the other roles, what they're doing really is they're iterating on what UX outputs.
Right.
And in terms of where they fit, well, typically they're doing it first, right? Because they're building out like the lightest weight prototype, and or I make the analogy of a UX practitioner as being like an architect for a building.
Yeah.
They want to know what kind of building the client wants. They want to know what what exactly they're going to build. And then they concern themselves with things like structural integrity, where are the doors and windows, what makes sense for people. So you wouldn't design a building in kind of little chunks.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe you would, but I don't think buildings typically get built that way. You draw out all of the blueprints and you negotiate that with the people that are the business stakeholders, and you get your blueprints sorted out, and then you move that on. Now, just like architecture, in UX, I don't think it's a good thing to have a waterfall approach where you're just handing off deliverables to the next step and you're not involved anymore, because it's iterative design. So maybe visual design gets the next pass, and then they make it look like the way that users are going to actually see it. The analogy there is like the interior designer of a building. So the architecture doesn't tell you what it's going to look like. It tells you how it's going to function. Then the interior designer comes in and they tell you how it's going to look like, right? And then dev, they actually build it. So they're the construction crew. They actually build it. So when the visual design happens, there may be changes to the wireframes. And then when dev gets it and they actually start building it, there may be further refinements and changes. So, everybody needs to be involved in the life cycle of the product, all through the whole process. Whereby the dev team, they may be working on based on the wireframes and the visual designs, but there may be some issue there, and they may need to consult with visual design or UX in order to get some direction on what they should do, because the UX and the visual design may not always be considering the finer details of the technology. So I think if you have a collaborative team and a collaborative workflow, that can work really well. And also too, like you can do agile and lean with UX. It just means that you have to accept that you're going to strip away to some degree that process of looking at the entire system and kind of building the entire system. There's no right and wrong way here. It's just what's the best methodology for what you're trying to achieve.
Let me just ask you one more question, Brett, because I got to respect your time. We got to move on here. But what do you see in most scenarios? Is UX usually a consulting role, or is it usually a staff role? Because I know you're a consultant, but what do you see generally? Like when you get together with, let's say, 100 of your or 99 of your UX peers, are 75 of them consultants and 25 full-time, or is it 50-50? Or?
No, it's majority of them are full-time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Because most of the teams out there, they're not just trying to achieve like one goal. And then the UX person moves on. It's an ongoing thing. And most organizations, they want to have employees. They want people to be involved in the teams on an ongoing basis. Consultants come in to fill in gaps, or to help mitigate longer term costs, because maybe a client or company doesn't want to necessarily make as big of a commitment. And some organizations, they'll actually hire even an entire team: UX, creative, project management, BA, business analyst, and developers. They may even hire a whole team all contractors in order to achieve some goal. Government does that a lot. So, but I would say in general that most UX practitioners are full-time. I think part of that too is because consulting is challenging from a cash flow perspective.
Yeah, for sure.
And as an employee, you know, it's just a lot easier to do the work and not think about it.
So let's leave that there. And what I'm hoping is to maybe have you on, you know, one or two more times, because there's so much in this topic, and you know, there's a million directions we could go here. But let's move on to the last question, because we're running up on time here. So the last question I always ask all my guests, Brett, is a lot of the listeners of this podcast are probably earlier on in their careers, and for their benefit, the question is, if you were to go back and give some advice to, let's say, the 15 or 20-year younger Brett, right, about UX, about you know, business in general, what advice would you give yourself?
I'd say that ultimately UX is a creative. It's a creative process. It's about problem solving and creating a solution, and that's creativity. It's not engineering so much. Right. And as a creative discipline, it means that you're gonna do what comes naturally to you. And so I would say, you know, work on being flexible, understand that the way that you like to do what you do as a UX practitioner is only one way of doing it. And the best thing you can do to make your life easier and to make better products and to be seen as easy to work with is to have flexibility. But when you start to feel that bump against what you do naturally as a creative person, leave it at that. Just accept yourself for who you are and the value that you bring to the table, and look for work that aligns with that. In other words, don't work too hard to try to fit yourself as a round peg in a square hole, because that's just one approach that maybe the people you're working with are using. And there are many approaches out there, and you seek out work that better aligns with what you do creatively.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. I like that. Good. So if we've got listeners who are hearing what you're saying here, Brett, and want to reach out to you maybe for a follow-up question, or to learn what else you're working on, what contact information are you comfortable sharing with our audience?
Sure. So you can look for me on LinkedIn. It's Brett Maraldo, BRETT MARALDO in Toronto. And you can email me at brett@usabilitynow.ca. You can also email me at brett@nobsux.ca.
Good. I like that one. Excellent. Well, Brett, thank you on behalf of Ready Product Radio and our listeners. This is a fascinating discussion, and like I say, I hope we can have you back on, because we're just scratching the surface of this, and I wanna cover UX really well on this podcast. So thank you for your time, and it's really been a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Today's podcast was brought to you by Eigenworks. Eigenworks specializes in win-loss analysis and customer development as a service. Get candid feedback to improve your sales approach, uncover competitive intelligence, and help you pivot as needed. Thank you for listening to this episode of Ready Product Radio, part of the Ready PDM network. This is when most podcasters ask you to leave a review on iTunes if you like the show. My only request is, if you found the show entertaining, inspiring, or informative, please share it with a colleague or friend who may feel the same way. Also, note that the views expressed in this episode do not necessarily reflect my views or the views of the Ready PDM network. If you want yourself or your product to be ready, then keep your eyes on your markets, your ears to your customers, your mind on their experiences, both good and bad, and finally keep your hearts in your products. Until next time, thank you for listening. You can contact us on Twitter at Ready Product Radio. That's RDYPRODUCTRADIO. And on the web at www.readyproductradio.com.
Gee, mate, what do you want to do tonight?
The same thing we do every night, Pinky. Try to take over the world.
You're still here? It's over. Go home. Go.